So over here in Pakistan, most of the discourse is already largely pro-Palestinian. So what I wanted to know about is because still there is a large amount of people that support the Israeli military worldwide, and what I don't understand is that, of course, when you look at the videos of Palestine and the extent to which they're suffering, anyone can just think, okay, how can the world look at this and ignore it? But there's still a large amount of people worldwide who, especially in America, support the Israeli military. And this is obviously because of social media largely being dominated a lot. A lot of the pro-Palestinian content is being taken down as false information, and a lot of like propaganda by the Israeli military is being spread as well. So my question to you is, as somebody who lives in America and is seeing sort of both sides of the picture, is what does, aside from the nationalist Israeli argument, what their side of the argument looks like, aside from just false information? How do they justify what they're doing to Palestine?
Well, thanks for your question. I mean, it's the narrative that they've presented is extremely weak, which is why it does not resonate with um, the masses. I mean, I think what we've seen in this war is a shift in the persuadable middle. Like there are people who are ideologically pro-Palestine or anti-Zionist or whatever you want to call it. There are people on the other side who are ideologically pro-Israel, Zionists. You can't do anything about them. And then there are people who are in the middle who can be persuaded either way. And this is really where this is what I call ideological struggle, is getting to those people. And is I mean my I have family members who are kind of they'll my family is like typical American Jews, like pro-Israel. And so I'll talk to them and they'll say like, they'll like say things to me that indicate clearly to me where, like, it's almost like taking a temperature of pro-Israel sentiment in the United States. And they'll just like, all they have is propaganda constructs. They'll ask me about like this guy, son of Hamas, the guy, this guy who's like a son of a prominent Hamas founder, who ended up working for Israel, and now he lives in the United States, and he converted to Christianity, and he's like a spy. And this guy, they have the 40 beheaded babies story, all these kinds of things. But they live in a very carefully kind of curated bubble where, the images, for example, of Israeli hostages being released from Gaza, where they, wave goodbye and smile to her captors, or they say peace, or they say shukran, anything like that, that is all hidden. And so none of that really penetrates the media bubble. It's just constant propaganda constructs, but they're failing in a way that I've never, ever seen before. All the claims about the Hamas command center under Al-Shifa hospital, that failed. The Israeli actress who pretended to be a doctor in Shifa hospital, that failed. All of these things are exposed. And so, I'm not expecting like average, kind of Zionists in the United States to break away, but that persuadable middle, I think, has really largely shifted as a result of the failure of the Israeli propaganda and the success of Israel's killing machine, where the amount of carnage that we've seen is just my neighbor, who is not a political person at all. She, I hadn't seen her. I was so busy. I hadn't seen her for a month. And I saw her and she said, she asked me how I am. And I told her I've just been really busy with everything happening in Gaza. And she said, oh, I know, it's horrible. They're just killing so many people. And so it's like, granted, she's one person, but it indicates to me that even to average Americans, it's getting through. The kind of the iron dome of Israeli propaganda is being penetrated. And we see it in the demonstrations, we see it in public opinion polls that the majority of Americans support a ceasefire in Gaza, even though the political parties don't. So I think we're really just in um, a watershed moment that was unthinkable even kind of before, on October 6th. I could never have imagined this would happen. And October 7th, I really could never have imagined. I mean, I will say on October 7th or 8th that, when I saw how many captives that Hamas had taken into Gaza, I said, this is like checkmate. Now Hamas has huge amounts of leverage. So like, what is Israel going to do? They can't do anything. Now they have to negotiate. So, I mean, it's a very painful period to see the amount of suffering and death, but it's not in vain. I think it's creating a huge fundamental shift in public opinion and diplomatically and just in all ways.
Hello, thank you so much for your documentary and your support for the Palestinian cause. Earlier, you mentioned how you spent time between Gaza and Israel. I was wondering if you can elaborate more in your time in Israel and whether there's like a huge contrast between life in Israel as compared to life in Gaza and Palestine.
Sure. I mean, yeah, it's an enormous contrast. And it's especially jarring, when I come and go between Gaza and Israel, because of that contrast, wherein, you can sit in Tel Aviv in like hipster cafes where, people are drinking beer and smoking all kinds of things and hanging out, and it feels like you're in like New York City a little bit or something like that, or in a Mediterranean kind of, like you're in Barcelona, is maybe it feels more like that. And then and you drive 45 minutes through open space, huge fields and agricultural areas, and it's very bucolic. And then enter Gaza, and it's just, even just entering Gaza is a very dystopian experience. Going through the Israeli checkpoint, which, is a series of, first it's like going through into an airport, and then you go into like these strange rooms where you can't see anyone, but they're looking at you from windows, from above. And it's like you're like cattle going through these kind of corridors. And then you come outside into this long at the very beginning, you saw that long cage, the very beginning of the documentary. That's how you enter and exit Gaza, into and out of Israel. That's the final thing. It's almost like a long eyedropper, that is reaching into Gaza so it can get one person at a time. In the same way that you might do, that like, I don't know, somebody studying insects might do, it's so it's incredibly dehumanizing. The conditions are absolutely brutal. But there's like, it feels more real in Gaza. There's no lies, there's nothing fake. When you go into the West Bank, into Ramallah, for example, this is the neoliberal capital of the West Bank that is not actually a capital, but is the de facto capital. It's the political and economic capital, because the United States and Israel and the European Union pump in huge amounts of money to keep this fake economy afloat. And you go into Ramallah and there's cafes and bars, and it does its best to imitate like live life in the West or life in Tel Aviv. But you can feel that it's a big lie, because just, like 1 kilometer away or 2 kilometers away, there are Israeli checkpoints where, people can be shot and killed, and frequently are. And at any time, the Israeli military can invade and take whoever they want or kill whoever they want. So, yeah, the contrast between the two is extreme. But I prefer to be in Gaza in many ways, just because it's the most real, it's the most honest. But did that answer the question? Okay. Okay. Great.
Hello. I have a very politically charged question. I understand you're a journalist, so you might perhaps have a more individualistic perspective on it. But one thing that I've been very confused about seeing, especially from the United States, is these televangelists who are profoundly anti-Semitic from the conservative kind of spectrum, being pro-Israel. So as someone who was born and raised Muslim in a Muslim majority country, who has also, probably seen sentiments of anti-Semitism here, I'm very confused about how the political contradiction of that works, because these are priests and preachers who will be spewing anti-Jewish hate, and they're now actually calling for an all-out assault on Gaza and the destruction of Palestine, and are actually politically pro-Israel. So, as someone who has a Jewish American, perhaps, heritage, what do you have to say about the kind of the conflation of really idiotic kind of contradictions that we see coming out from conservatives in the United States? And are you seeing that sentiment, if at all, changing?
Yeah, it's a huge contradiction. The one thing to understand is that Zionism actually has roots in Christian Protestant beliefs, not in it's originally a Protestant ideology that really came about in Britain, and the idea that all Jews have to return. I'm using scare quotes to the land of Israel, and that will initiate some kind of apocalyptic war in which the Antichrist who I think they believe is at least half Jewish, will then battle the real Messiah, Jesus, and then all Jews, basically most Jews, will burn in hell for eternity, and a few will be saved, will be converted. And that is the ideology that is quite prominent among the evangelical Christian population here in the United States, and it's largely what motivates pro-Israel sentiment and Christian Zionism. If you look at Jewish Zionism, it's actually totally contradictory to the Jewish religion. Even if you go back to the time of Herzl, around the turn of the 20th century, he was Zionism, and Theodor Herzl, who was the father of political Zionism, he was denounced not only by Orthodox Jews, who saw him as a sinner and a false Messiah, but also by Reform Jews, which is kind of the tradition that I come from, because they understood that Zionism. There was a famous German rabbi whose name eludes me at the moment, but he said that Zionism draws from the same toxic pond that anti-Semitism draws from. So he understood that it was racist, and he was correct, and he rejected it on those grounds, not even on the religious grounds. But so all around, Jews rejected it, but because Herzl had powerful connections, and the European powers saw Zionism as useful because they hated Jews and they wanted to get rid of Jews, so they had something in common. Lord Arthur Balfour in the UK, he thought, great, I can get rid of Jews. He was a raging anti-Semite and Islamophobe, and he hated Arabs, and he wanted to get rid of Jews. So great, send them to Palestine, send them anywhere else. And so same with Tsar Nicholas in Russia, in Tsarist Russia at that point, who was carrying out pogroms in the Pale of Settlement, where my family, where my ancestors are from. Herzl met with him in order to gain support for Zionism, and he told he supported Zionism on the basis that it would prevent Jews. Zionism would prevent Jews from becoming revolutionaries, from being drawn to communism. So Herzl wrote in his diary that that the anti-Semites will become our closest allies. And so that's what's happened. And so you see this to this day. I mean, several months ago, the Azov battalion, the Ukrainian Nazi Azov battalion, was touring in Israel, meeting in the Knesset, in their parliament. I mean, there's a very, very deep and long history of Zionist collaboration with anti-Semites and Nazis that is documented and out there, but kind of carefully hidden from the public eye. And so that's kind of one of the goals of this documentary I'm working on now, is to divorce Judaism from Zionism, because it's a complete myth that Zionism is a sort of natural or organic expression of Judaism. It is completely against Judaism in essentially all ways. So yeah, I mean that, just at the there was a big pro-Israel rally here about 2 weeks ago that I went to. For some reason, I decided to torture myself and go to that. And John Hagee spoke there, who's a big Christian Zionist pastor, and he has said that the Antichrist will be half Jewish. And this guy's welcome at the pro-Israel rally. So, I mean, it's Zionists love anti-Semites. Zionism is anti-Semitic, is the reality of it.
Okay, so as mentioned by a couple of people over here, that the discourse in Pakistan, I think it's it's increased quite a lot over the last month. And at least we in our classes, we discuss it quite a bit. And there's like a very clear-cut alliance, not only politically, but I think economically. Like, we've got boycotts going on, we've had protests, we've had fundraisers. But what I wanted to ask was, where do you move on from this? Because when you're in a country that is very clearly has an alliance with one side, what more can you do to increase that visibility? We do post on social media and stuff, but again, with the silencing that Meta has been conducting, it's not really that effective. So again, for someone in Pakistan, what would be the way forward? And like 2 years ago, when there was an upsurge in the violence, it died down the moment the violence ended. So how do you keep it, how can you increase the long-term effects for people in Pakistan over here?
Well, I think there's naturally, when the kind of headlines and the images quiet down, if this ceasefire does become permanent or, I don't know, indefinite, then, we're going to see naturally a decrease, I guess, in global interest. But, it continues to be important to speak out, to not, I try to not be too emotionally driven, because emotions come and go. For the first month or 5 weeks or so, I didn't sleep more than, maybe 5 hours a night. And eventually you run out of energy, your body collapses. And so, it's important to be steady and, do things for kind of ideological reasons and not be purely driven by emotion. So with that said, it's hard for me to say, how you can kind of raise awareness and fight back in Pakistan. It's, not my specialty, I would say, the political situation there. But, I think it's still good to post on social media. And also, I think it's important to understand that Zionism is not only about Palestine. It's really a form of imperialism, of Western imperialism. And, to understand, Zionists have been involved, Israel and Zionism has been involved in many, many genocides and conflicts around the world. I've written about what a court in Colombia, in Latin America, a court ruled that there was a political genocide of a left-wing political party, and Israel was directly involved in that. Israel trained paramilitaries in Colombia that carried out this genocide. And so to basically see that, for such a relatively small piece of geography of land, Israel's involved in all kinds of horrible things all around the world. I mean, obviously, Israel has very strong ties with India. And so I think that's something, you could do is highlight, ties there. I don't know what what ties Israel has with the current government in Pakistan. I don't know. But I think these are, I think these are all things to look at is it's not just about like Palestinians and their suffering and what's going on in Gaza. It's about a global system and understanding that there are many, many fronts. Even where I'm from Arizona in the southwest of the United States, close to the US-Mexico border. And there are towers, surveillance towers that are created by Elbit Systems, an Israeli company. And these are used to surveil and target migrants going across the border. And so understanding how this technology and these systems are exported into various corners of the world, I think is essential. And to look at how that affects, your country or your region, I think is key.
Hello, Dan. Thank you for making this documentary. It was heartbreaking, but genuinely really glad that you could show us what was happening there. I have a question that's linked to your roots, essentially, when you've mentioned that you grew up Jewish, and you've also mentioned your parents a bit, being a nice sort of thermometer for figuring out what the sentiments are in America, whether they're pro-Israel or not, or what sort of the effect of the propaganda that Israel has in America. I'm curious that what made you in 2014, growing up in America, being Jewish, having parents that are also conservative, to speak, what made you curious and what made you go to Gaza in 2014? Because I feel like that's a journey within itself to decide to go there and figure out what the story really is, especially when you're bombarded with everything that you are. So yeah, that's the question I'm curious about.
Yeah. So, I mean, growing up as a mostly secular Jew in the United States, you're not really taught the theology, per se, of Judaism. And so what that gets replaced with is just about your identity. You're Jewish, this happened. And, of course, the Holocaust becomes a big part of that and, becomes like almost like generational trauma that's passed on. And when you have trauma, that kind of, can be almost, I don't want to say manipulated, but sort of, turned in any certain way. And so the answer to that trauma is, becomes Zionism. And that's what they want to tell us, that Zionism provides security for Jews. And also this is your home. This is really your home country. This is where your roots are, even though I don't have any, family, going back there. And so I kind of, but I grew up in a pretty multicultural, I grew up in a suburb of Phoenix, Arizona, in like a typical Western American city. Like you kind of might see in the movies to some degree. And I grew up with friends from all kinds of different backgrounds. And so my kind of identity didn't matter so much to me. And so like Zionism was never, it didn't really resonate with me. And then as I got a bit older, I just started to, when I was in university, I started to like study history, and I took a class, history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the history shocked me. And so I spent years kind of studying it, and I didn't know what I wanted to do coming out of university. And I thought about, at one point I started to think about journalism, but I didn't think I was like cut out for that. And I wasn't like a high achiever. I wasn't like a great student. I much preferred to be like outside rock climbing in the mountains and this kind of thing. And so, but I got to a point where I was just like kind of, I wanted to do something more with my life rather than just be outside and enjoying nature. And so, long story short, I just got to a point where I just thought like, well, I have this kind of knowledge I've developed in Palestine. It's also something that like I felt angry to a degree once I realized that I was lied to by my kind of community, that it's not this, multicultural, diverse, liberal paradise that I had been told, that it's something completely different. And so I thought, well, maybe I can kind of, I don't know, get away with some things and show my community what reality is and this kind of thing. And so, I mean, I long ago gave up on trying to like really convince anyone, from my community. But, so yeah, I mean, none of it was really planned out. Like I'm not good at planning. It was just like go with, my gut and see what happens. And then, when I went to Gaza, I didn't have plans to go there. I just got a press card and okay, I'm going to Gaza. It's a ceasefire for 5 days, so I'm going. And then I stayed after the ceasefire, and then I, stayed, and then I went back again and again. So, it's just kind of like how, where like life took me is really what it is.
Hello. Thank you so much, by the way, for coming. It's been a great honor hosting you. I just wanted to ask a question about the solutions to this conflict, because I personally feel really confused about taking stances. So when I think about two-state solution, I first feel that it's very unjust to the Palestinians, because most of what Israel has, and even under the two-state solution, all of what it will have is land that has been wrongfully stolen from the Palestinians. At the same time, it seems like a more pragmatic approach, considering there are settlements that have already been made, generations that have already been raised. So there's a lot of practical questions that, all right, where do these people go then? But then when you think about the one-state solution, which I personally lean towards more, but I'm still confused about, because how do you erase that kind of hate that is embedded in both sides? If a Palestinian sees an Israeli, that person thinks that these are people who have continuously oppressed our families for generations. At the same time, I would think that if, let's say, Jewish Israelis are supposed to stay in that land after a particular solution, then even for them, the years of propaganda and the fact that they have systematic support within the government, I don't see how even that turns out favorably. So what will be your outlook towards a future peace process within this region? I was hoping to ask you.
I mean, I think the only just solution is for one state democratic solution, where everyone has the same rights. All of the inhabitants of the country, which, Israel controls all borders of historic Palestine, except for the southern crossing from Gaza, which is controlled by Egypt for Israel. So Israel is fundamentally in control. So, what liberal Zionists have been worried about for years and years and years, even though they have at the same time enabled it, is that there would become a one-state apartheid reality, and the two-state solution would become impossible. And that is what the Israeli government has done, has made the two-state solution impossible in practical terms, let alone whether it would ever be accepted, and and let alone the fact that it does not address the legal rights of the Palestinian refugees to return to their homes. There are, hundreds of thousands or millions of refugees living in refugee camps in Lebanon and Syria and Jordan, and many people in exile in other countries. And so they have the rights as refugees legally enshrined to return. Now, so to me, it's the obvious solution is democracy. Everyone has the same rights. Now, as you alluded to, one of the big questions is what happens with, Israelis who are so heavily propagandized. Well, I think what there has to be, and what is happening, is there's a crisis of faith in the Israeli leadership, which there very much is. The Israeli public, broadly speaking, hates the politicians. They see them as a bunch of clowns. But what they believe in as if it's something completely different, is the military, the Israeli military. It is the heart of Israeli society. And they see it as something that is not political at all, which of course it's inherently political. But only when there, I think, is a crisis of faith in the military is when Israelis will be kind of forced to deal with reality. Like the Israelis who are now the most amenable to some kind of real political solution to this conflict are the ones who have had their family members taken captive into Gaza. They're the ones who got a little taste of what it is to be a Palestinian, to be on the other side of the wall. And so now it's like, wait a minute, okay, let's negotiate, give them all their prisoners, like we want to live, and it's like the Israelis want to be Palestinians. They want to eat hummus and falafel and say I'm from this land and have all the benefits of it, but they don't want to have any of the challenges or any of the negative things that come with that. And so when they get a taste of that, then their mentality starts to change. That's when they really become like real locals in a way. And so I think, if it does progress to that point that there's some kind of one state solution, democratic solution, I think there are a fair amount of Israelis who will leave the country, who simply are so racist. They don't want to be around any Arabs or any Muslims or anyone that they deem unworthy or subhuman, and they'll leave and maybe go to Europe or go to the United States or wherever. But South Africa got through apartheid, and now it's, obviously not a perfect society, but there is a precedent for these kinds of things. And so I think, Israeli society has a long way to go, but what's just happened kind of advances it to that, to some kind of outcome. I can't say for sure that's what's going to happen, but there's a deep crisis in Israeli society where even just in the summer, before any of this was happening, there have been huge protests against Benjamin Netanyahu because of the so-called judicial reform that he and his ultra-right partners are pushing through, which basically gets rid of the last kind of veneers or facades of Israeli democracy. It severely limits the Supreme Court, et cetera, et cetera. And there were huge protests, massive protests that have been going on for years against Netanyahu and this judicial coup, as they've called it. And the Times of Israel, an Israeli newspaper, said that 30% of Israelis were considering leaving the country. 30%. Now, that divide has not gone away. It has been temporarily papered over by the unity that comes with wartime. But as soon as this war is over, which it very well may be, then that divide is going to be right back. There's going to be a huge political shakeup. And no matter what, Israel is coming out of this weakened. So I would say at least 30% of Israelis will be considering leaving. I spoke to an Israeli friend who told me he has Canadian citizenship. He told me, yeah, I've moved a lot of my money to Canada. He said he did that in the summer. So you can't, it's hard to honestly overstate the crisis in Israeli society. But this creates opportunity if there is political will to have some kind of more positive outcome, is what I think.
Hello. Thank you so much for taking out your time to be with us here. So I have two questions, both of which you roughly touched upon, but I would like to be more specific this time around. The first thing I wanted to ask is, how USA is pumping so much money? They're funding Israel basically. They're giving more, the healthcare in Israel is free for all, while USA still has so much of their own problems to deal with, and still they're pumping money into Israel. And so my question basically is, what does the US serve to gain from all of this? Why are they such diehard supporters of Israel? There must be something in it for them to essentially give them so much money constantly. So that's my first question. My second question is, like, the immediate after effects, the immediate results of this ceasefire. You're saying it's going to be prolonged into like a longer pause, but at the end of the day, we still have that fear that maybe Israel would attack again. So what's like the precautions, the preventions we can have from this ever occurring again? And will this ever occur again in your estimation? And moreover on that is, do we see the Palestinians returning to North Gaza, or is it now part of Israeli territory again? Not again, but is it part of Israeli territory now? And do we see an end to the occupation in the near future? I'm so sorry, this is a lot to take in, but those are my questions.
Sure. So, I mean, I'm sure, everyone has heard of the Israel lobby, which is quite powerful. And the fact is, you have Jewish Americans in this country who have become quite successful, and not a majority of us, but over the last 100+ years, have become quite successful through entrepreneurship and this kind of thing. And a lot of these wealthier Jews see Israel as their, the thing they have to support as part of their identity. And, this is a good thing I'm doing. There's that. There's also, of course, large, we discussed Christian Zionism before. So there's a lot of fertile ground for that. We look at the Israel lobby, in which, there's an excellent documentary, or there are two of them really, done by Al Jazeera, called The Lobby. And there's one about Israeli interference in UK politics and one about Israeli interference in US politics. And those are incredible documentaries. They really expose how the Israel lobby operates at various levels of government, and they're essential watching. There's also the great book that came out, more than a decade ago now, The Israel Lobby by Stephen Walt and John Mearsheimer. But you can't understate. You can't understate all of that. There's also the Epstein question, which Jeffrey Epstein, the pedophile sex trafficker who ran basically an operation, a blackmail operation. So anyone, and apparently did that on behalf of the Mossad, Israeli intelligence. So anyone who thought about speaking out, could be destroyed with a photo released of what they were up to on Jeffrey Epstein's airplane or on his island in the Caribbean Sea, or maybe in his house in New York. So there are many kind of, there are different parts to that answer, but broadly speaking, why does the United States go against its own interests? I think, another part is ideologically, there are the segments of the political class here that see Israel as the model of the kind of governance they would like, that any journalist, say, who speaks out or exposes something that they don't like, well, they can do what Israel would do, throw them in prison, kill them. In 2010 or 2011, maybe, I think 2011, Hillary Clinton asked if we could just use a drone to kill Julian Assange. Now, this is, because of his leaks, because he had exposed what Hillary Clinton's State Department was doing. This is kind of Israeli style. It's not Israel. Israel's not the only country that does this. Obviously, the United States carries out, drone strikes, and in your region of the world in particular, on anyone who, it wants, more or less. So there's a sort of, there are very strong similarities between the two countries. The United States, in many ways, Israel is kind of the most severe image of the United States. So it's like, the thing is, in the United States, we have a constitution, we have, elements of a democracy that do not exist in Israel. And so, the powers that be here would love to get rid of those things that, in order to really become like a big Israel. So I think you have to look at the Israel lobby, but I think that's the part that is not talked about is like the ideological aspects of how the powers that be here in the United States want to emulate Israel. In terms of like, there were a couple questions in there. One of the other questions about like what happens now with Gaza if there is this, not extended, more than an extended ceasefire or an indefinite ceasefire. I mean, I think, Israel has, and are we going to see this again? It's hard for me to see this happening again, this level of destruction, because Israel lost. Like, this has been a long-term process, one assault after the next, after the next, after the next, and Benjamin Netanyahu telling the Israeli public that, like, this is, I can manage this conflict. We have Hamas deterred, and then just being totally discredited. And so one side has to win and one side has to lose here. And I don't think Hamas is going to lose, because them losing means they're defeated, and they are not defeated. Israel can't defeat them militarily without just committing complete genocide of Gaza, which, is not feasible politically. And secondly, so Israel cannot fulfill, Netanyahu and Israel cannot fulfill what they set out to do, what they stated they would do, which is defeat Hamas. It's a false promise. Hamas its victory is existing. It doesn't have to defeat Israel in terms of, militarily defeat. It has to fight it to a stalemate, which is what it's done. It's shown again and again, but especially now, that it can resist and that it cannot be defeated militarily. So Israel lost. This is what's happening. I mean, I think Israel lost weeks and weeks ago, but now it's becoming totally clear. So with the amount of destruction that Israel has caused, particularly in northern Gaza, I don't know where it goes. I mean, I don't think Israel's going to be able to, establish settlements or anything like that. That's all a fantasy. But it's a great question. I don't know, what's gonna happen now. Is there going to be some kind of reconstruction? I mean, it's in Israel's interest in a way to rebuild Gaza. That's why, there's that op-ed that came out today in Haaretz that I mentioned earlier, where the former Israeli prime minister is saying, we need to get a NATO intervention to defeat Hamas, and then we need to get the Palestinian Authority in there. And that's about rebuilding Gaza. Because if you just have this massive humanitarian crisis on your hands, then it's completely unstable. And so they're desperate for a way to kind of turn back the clock to get out of this situation that they've created. But they have a situation that they cannot handle on their own. So I don't know where it goes, but it's, the status quo has been completely upended, and Hamas has arrived on the international stage. Last thing, I interviewed Bassem Naim, who's a high-ranking Hamas, basically diplomat. He was in Russia meeting with the foreign ministry. He told me he had secret meetings with European leaders. So it's just a completely different paradigm. Israel's isolating itself internationally, and Hamas is gaining international recognition. It's a fascinating time.
We hope that your assessment of the situation is the correct assessment of the situation, and we hope that this very tragic yet important victory for Hamas and the Palestinian people will bring fruit, and inshallah we will see the one-state solution soon, with the Palestinian people free and with their capital in Jerusalem, in Al-Quds. Thank you for your time, Dan. We we'll hope for a better turnout, but we'll keep trying. We'll keep trying. I think the Zionist lobby has gotten to the universities in Pakistan. We will, people who have stuck around to the end of the conversation, I guess, got to hear the more spicy, the sort of juicier takes. Just one last question before we close. You talked about the international money laundering operation and sex trafficking operation that was being run by Jeffrey Epstein and his partner Ghislaine Maxwell, daughter of Robert Maxwell, who is an alleged Mossad agent also. There's one person who's clearly indestructible, and that's Piers Morgan. Even though his pictures with Ghislaine Maxwell have come out, somehow his career as the fence between Zionists and pro-Palestinian voices, somehow it keeps going on. Do you want to close in on Piers Morgan and what you think that whole story is? Why does he keep bringing on Palestinian voices, and yet at the same time he keeps completely sidelining the Palestinian cause?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know if it's just, to me, it shows kind of a success of, Palestinian, like, whatever. I don't know. I don't particularly like the term pro-Palestine because it's so reductive, because I'm not it's not that I'm pro-Palestine. I'm like pro-justice, but yeah, I mean, in terms of bringing on pro-Palestine voices and personalities, it's interesting. I mean, I guess he assumes, or maybe his producers, whoever's pulling his strings, assume that maybe they think it's good ratings, which I guess it is to a degree, or maybe they think that Zionists are going to come out on top. But it's a good question. It's kind of maybe a disappointing answer, but I don't know why he continues to do it. But I mean, it's good. It shows it's a success, even though, he's totally tied to the Israel lobby. It shows a shift in the Overton window, I suppose, the allowable discourse that, and now they'll have like debates. Yeah, I suppose it's a positive.
I mean, it's not nothing. For the Palestinian cause, it's not nothing compared to the coverage that we're used to for Palestine or Muslims and Arabs in general. Dan, thank you for your time, and we're gonna keep pestering you for more screenings and hopefully more vibrant Q&A sessions in other universities as well as in LUMS again, hopefully. And we're hoping that your documentary will come out soon, and that we can screen it in Pakistan with you physically here. Let the people know where they can follow you and where they can support financially, as well as where they can share on their socials, the work that you're doing.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me, and thanks to the diehards who stuck around till the bitter end. But you can follow me. I'm most active on Twitter at Dan Cohen 3000. I'm starting to use Instagram more. My outlet is at Uncaptured News on Twitter. It's called Uncaptured Media, but that was already taken, so I had to go with Uncaptured News on Twitter. But follow me there. If you want to contribute anything towards the documentary I'm working on, you can look at my pinned tweet. There's a link to buy me a coffee, or thank you so much for having me, and thanks everyone for staying, and go home, get some rest.